Welcome to today's conversation, Do I Have the Right to Feel Safe? A Vision for Holistic Safety in Corrections. I am Dr. Nika Jones Tapia, Managing Director of Justice Initiatives at Chicago Beyond, an impact investor working to ensure justice for all young people and communities. I'm also a clinical psychologist and the former warden of Cook County Jail here in Chicago, Illinois. Thank you to our small in-person audience, as well as to our larger virtual audience joining us today. We will be joined momentarily by an incredible group of panelists who I know you're going to enjoy. Unfortunately, due to travel difficulties, Kevin from Correctional Leaders Association is unable to join us today, but please stay tuned for Kevin and I to be in conversation at a later date. Also, near the end of the program, we will have a few minutes to take questions from our virtual audience. So for those of you who are watching us through Zoom, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and we will get to as many of those as we can at the end. So now let's talk. Many people joining us today understand, I believe, the impact that incarceration has on people. But some people are still questioning why we should care about what happens in jails and prisons. And the truth is that what happens in jails and prisons across this country impacts all of us. The people who are directly impacted by this system is numerous. Every year, people enter our nation's jails more than 10 million times. They enter our nation's prisons more than 600,000 times. And they carry the trauma of these systems with them. In the last 40 years, the number of women who are incarcerated in these systems has expanded more than 475%. And more than 50% of the women who are incarcerated in these prisons are mothers to children under the age of 18. Almost half of all US adults in this country have an immediate family member who is or has been incarcerated. Over half. And there are more than 400,000 correctional staff working in these facilities every day. And they carry with them the trauma from these institutions as they interact with us in every sector of society. Our response to trauma as a society has been abysmal. Particularly in Black and brown neighborhoods, we have responded to trauma through control and through punishment. The primary mechanism for that punishment has been incarceration. This unending cycle of violence, incarceration, more violence, has only had the outcome of lives lost. For every 1 year that a person is incarcerated, they lose 2 years off of their life. Correctional staff have a life expectancy that's 20 years lower than the general population. And recent research found that just by having an incarcerated loved one in your immediate family, you lose 2.5 years of life. Incarceration in this country is a public health crisis, but there's hope. Correctional administrators, funders, policymakers, lawmakers, all understand that we must do something different. And that something different has to include opportunity instead of further exclusion and isolation. They understand that we can hold people accountable while still creating the conditions for them to be and feel well, whole, protected, and resilient. That is holistic safety. That is what people who have been directly impacted by this system have been advocating for a very long time. So this conversation is long overdue. Chicago Beyond, in partnership with almost 100 people who have been directly impacted by this system, recently published Do I Have the Right to Feel Safe? A vision for holistic safety in corrections, to share a pathway forward. That pathway forward starts with all of us standing together, being in conversation, hearing each other, truly listening to each other, and to ensure that people who have been impacted by this system have the resources and the supports that they need to thrive, and to fundamentally shift the way all of us view people impacted by incarceration, and to understand the power that everyone has to shift this system. Two people I am proud to stand with in this moment where we are pushing for holistic safety, and who are also on the cover of Do I Have the Right to Feel Safe, are Ronald Simpson Bay, Executive Vice President for Just Leadership USA, and Andy Potter, founder and Executive Director of One Voice United. You guys acted like you were scared to clap for a second. Welcome, Ronald and Andy. Both of you spent more than 25 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections and are now leading this nation in criminal legal reform. One as a former officer, one as a former person who was incarcerated. Your organizations are empowering people who have been impacted by this system. One, Just Leadership USA, for people who are currently and formerly incarcerated, and One Voice United for staff who are in these systems. So now that we've established you have street cred, right? Like, you've been in these streets in criminal legal reform for a long time. And so you know that there's a lot of reform happening across the country. But sadly, most of the reform that's happening are happening in executive offices. And they're happening only with executive staff. And they fail to include the people who are most impacted by this system. I'd love for you to talk with our audience a little bit about how critical it is for us to engage people with lived experience in this system.
Oh, thank you for having me. That's a great question. I'm excited to be here. My name is Ronald Simpson Bay. I'm the Executive Vice President of Just Leadership USA. I'm surprised my face fit on this cover. To answer your question, I mean, to have the people most impacted being part of the process, that's the DNA of Just Leadership USA, because we believe that those closest to the problem are closest to the solutions, but furthest away from resources and power to do anything about it. So we always seek to elevate and amplify the voices of those most impacted by the system, because they're the ones that are going to give you the best, outcomes of what the reform should be. I used to always say that, not have people directly impacted by the system at the table having these reform conversations is like not having women at the table for reproductive rights conversation. We see how that's going right now, but we're in the process of trying to make sure that everybody who's most impacted have an opportunity to speak and have input.
Andy?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Ronald said. And I would also say, out of the folks that are most impacted, you have two of the largest stakeholders in criminal justice reform: those who are incarcerated and those who work there. And when you miss some of those voices, especially the staff who work in the same environment as those who live there, you're not only losing that perspective, you're losing the legacy of change. Every day they come in, they spend time together. And some of these staff have generations, like myself. I spent most of my adult life working inside and around the correctional system. So that's legacy. And if we really want to see the change that we're all hoping for, and by the way, corrections officers and other frontline staff want this change. We just went through a gathering last week where a lot of them spoke about the trauma that they face. And in that, all of them said they want change as well. So that's the legacy of the change has to be with that staff that continuously come in day after day.
I want to push a little further because, Andy, I know you say that correctional staff want change, but there are some of us, me included, who have had negative experiences with correctional staff and unions when we have pushed for reform. You and I have spoken about my reluctance to engage unions. What is your advice to people in positions of power who have had negative experiences with staff when it comes to pushing for reform?
I would say, I just heard this the other day. Some of you, I think, will understand this, and maybe some others won't. Folks who work in and around the correctional system, there's two things. They don't like the way it is, and they don't like change. So, in saying that, I would say that as union leaders, we have not done a good enough job, myself included, to bring them to the table of change, to help shape what success can look like for them as well as those who are incarcerated. I would say, though, that some of this reluctancy to change is culture. We have to change hearts and minds to change culture. You can't just change policy and think that's going to change a culture, because it won't. It has to be good leadership. Like one of our other guests here, John. When we have leadership building cohort and everyone can sit at a table and help shape what the environment looks like, what the condition can look like, and what their work can look like, and they can feel some of the same success when a prison closes and not feel fear that they're just going to lose their livelihood. When we get to that point, I think then we can start to say that we've started to reshape a system that includes everybody in that change of success.
Now, we were talking a few weeks ago, and I know, Ronald, you brought up an interesting point that I think a lot of people will relate to. When we talk about the kind of reforms that we need in this system, it ultimately will mean that correctional staff will lose jobs, and that makes people uncomfortable. And I'm wondering, like, Andy, how can we engage staff and unions in a way that they understand that job loss is a positive in this push for reform? And how do we expect for them to engage with this work, understanding that they could lose their job?
I think it's a bigger question. I think we have to do a better job. We did some work with the University of Michigan, and we did impact studies, economic impact studies on small towns and places where they've put these prisons strategically, right? And so when you see a prison closing, perhaps, you'll see people out there with signs picketing, right? Trying not to close the prison. They're not saying they want people incarcerated. They have just known that this is an industry that was put, and I hate to say industry because it has to do with human beings, and I don't like that. But I will say that they've grown to know that that's a pathway for them, perhaps, like myself, into the middle class. So when we talk about having less correctional staff, that's success, because that means the population hopefully is dropping as well. But we have to do a better job building a pipeline into other careers, perhaps. And we have to do a better job showing and helping those staff that come in every day and really want to do what's best for humanity, that there's other opportunities, and we should help create that, not just leave them to their own, right? We should help create what those other opportunities look like. That's just one way. I think the other thing we have to do a better job of doing is not just closing a prison to be able to check a box to say that we've done some reform and we've done some good and we've closed a prison, because In some cases, that means people are just jammed into another prison in living conditions that are even worse. And so I'm not advocating that we keep a whole bunch of prisons open and we fill them. I'm advocating that we think about this smarter than we have in the past, that's all.
Thank you for that. And what I'm hearing you say is correctional administrators should really lean into these difficult conversations and really fully engage people in a way, particularly staff, in a way that they see the benefit to this for them. What I have said before is that correctional staff are literally dying for a paycheck. And I think the more that we talk about the impact of these systems to staff, the more likely we are to have more staff on board when we push for significant reforms. Now, I also know that correctional administrators have been leery about engaging people who are and have been incarcerated. You know, many of them fear the safety and security of their institution. We're not talking to people who have been incarcerated. They don't think about all that can be gained by having conversations, real conversations at their policy table with people who are incarcerated. So Ronald, you've experienced this on multiple fronts. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what correctional administrators can gain by bringing people currently and formerly incarcerated to the policy-making table.
Thank you for that question. If I could piggyback off what he was talking about as far as officers being laid off from their jobs, losing their jobs because of reductions in corrections. I'm old enough. I used to work for General Motors before I went to prison back in the 80s. And when GM was downsized, I'm originally from Michigan, and Flint had like 50,000 GM workers. And when they talked about closing the plants, they opened job banks. They taught the workers that were going to lose their jobs new skills. They made them employable in other areas, and they never got the automotive jobs back, but they had jobs in other areas. So I think that's a model that could be looked at by corrections as well. But to your question, as far as engaging directly impacted people, as far as the administration, when I was inside, I was the chairman of what used to be called the Wardens Forum. We were a group of elected incarcerated people that would go take problems to the wardens and just have discussions on how to make the system better. And we were real instrumental in helping them realize that some of the policies they were pushing were going to create problems. A good example of that, one time they decided to close what was called the honor block and move everybody that's unemployed into one particular cell block. You know what's going to happen when you put everybody that don't have jobs in one area, going to increase the violence. So we had a conversation with the warden. Hey, this is not good. This is not a good idea. This is going to blow up in your face. He thought about it and he rescinded it and left everything as it was. Another time, I was on a case, a class action lawsuit called Kane versus MDOC, and it dealt with conditions of confinement inside of jails and prisons. And we would read the policies before the department released them. They would give them to us 30 days prior to them implementing them. Me and other plaintiffs, we would read them and say, hey, this is a hold, this is a hold, this is a hold. And they would either correct them or not implement the policy. So we were able to have some traction on that. We never got credit, but we like to be part of the process to be able to engage them around the policy they were trying to implement.
Now this sounds well and good, but we all know, for those of us who have been in a correctional institution, we know that there is this culture of us versus them. Right. Between staff and people incarcerated. What would be your advice to correctional administrators as they're thinking about engaging these two stakeholder groups in a way that erodes that us versus them culture? If you can talk a little bit about that and your experiences to kind of illuminate for us what can be done.
I mean, overcoming the culture is a huge problem because it's intrinsic. It's a person's DNA. If you talk to dislike a person for whatever reason, race, creed, or color, you're going to dislike that person subconsciously. And it's the same thing in corrections. Like you said, it's us versus them. But it takes people like Andy and myself who disregard the us versus them dynamic and actually engage. And we do it at a risk to our clients, our constituents, people that we represent. But when they see it's being successful, well, maybe we should try it. And administrators, if they would just open up and not be so hard on the officers that want to engage us as humans, because they're the line staff. They engage us each and every day on the things that we do. And so they're the ones that's closest to the problem. However, they aren't being referred to or given any credence on what they do as far as engaging us around the issues inside of jails and prisons.
Yeah. I would say that I'll put something into perspective. Ronald and I agree on a lot of things. There's things we don't agree on. That's not an us versus them. We've taken that out of our relationship. And we can understand the system for what it is. And we both have been in and around this to know what's real and what's the truth. And as an officer, the very first day that I'm brought into training, I'm being conditioned to not trust anybody. Right? Anatomy of a setup. This is something I can tell you is the very first thing. If you were to say, what are you trained about when you go into work for the Department of Corrections? Anatomy of a setup. You do not trust anybody. I was told you keep a pen and paper in your hand and you keep notes about even who you work with. That's conditioning from day one. That conditioning removes your humanity, your dignity, and it desensitizes you and hardens you so that you can remove someone else's dignity and humanity along the way. This rips your vulnerability right out of you. Now, I can say in my life now, I can see this for what it really is, and I can see the truth. But the us versus them isn't just with those who are incarcerated and those who work there as an officer. It's also there when it comes to management and the officers. There's an us versus them. Because it's paramilitary. You take orders, you don't question those orders, even if you know those orders are just wrong. And I have been asked to do those things, and I've refused. And it's a huge risk for a lot of reasons we can get into later, but where it does work, and in the Department of Corrections in the state that I come from, I had a great director years ago, Pat Caruso. She allowed me, vice president of the union that represented the officers, to be a part of a work group that wrote a manual about how to confront MRSA. Now, MRSA infected those who work there and those who live there, right? That's where it works great because it's a great manual. It's a great, that's where the policy comes in that it works well. It doesn't always work well. And where it doesn't, you shouldn't just point a finger and say it's not successful, right?
So making sure that we tackle the policies, I think, that exist in correctional institutions that uplift that us versus them culture is going to be paramount, because it is that us versus them culture that really sets the foundation for the dehumanization that Andy and Ronald just described. Now, we've been hearing a lot about the state of jails and prisons and the importance of engaging people with lived experience. I want to also talk about the reality that change can't happen without leaders who are willing to stand with people who are directly impacted by this system and really shift this system towards holistic safety. Leaders who are willing to tell the whole story that's happening in corrections, not just the good, but also the bad that we know exists in these institutions, and really thinking about how we shift towards holistic safety. I want to bring in a powerful leader in correctional reform, someone who I respect and admire for everything that he has done and everything that he continues to do in this movement towards holistic safety. John Wetzel is the former Secretary of Corrections for the Department of Corrections in Pennsylvania, and the CEO of Fronema Justice Strategies. Please welcome John.
All right, John.
Thank you.
So, John, I really want you to talk about your work. I'm sure many people sitting in the audience, as well as in our virtual audience, are excited to see you here. But before you talk about your work, I would love for you to just respond to anything that you heard Kevin and, Andy and Ronald talking about in terms of like how these systems are and what we can do to really shift them.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Thank you, and thank you all. Unfortunately, Kevin couldn't be here, but shout out to Kevin Kemp. He would have been a nice addition to this. But I love the start of this. And I wish it'd be cool to kind of pull the room, because I think it'd be a really interesting thing to see how many people think it's important to feel safe. Guess what? If we were sitting inside a prison or jail, same damn thing had happened. So this notion of safety, it should be so obvious, right? And I think, unfortunately, right now more than ever, we look for excuses to say us versus them. But if we strip the world down to interests, it starts with safety, and we all want that, right? And I've been in corrections a fair amount of time. I started when I was 2, so it's now my 32nd year. And I will tell you that I've never seen a situation where incarcerated people are doing great and the staff are doing poorly, or vice versa. I really haven't seen that, because the kind of environment that would cause that disparate outcome would not be a healthy environment. And so it's interesting. It's kind of funny to me when you say, that people sitting in my seat need to, give away some of our power and let people sit at the table. I would tell you, I was the longest serving person in the history of Pennsylvania. And corrections started in Pennsylvania, by the way. So it's been a minute, 11 years. And if you think you're running the system and you're running the system, you don't know what you're doing. I think it's an actual fact that when you quote unquote give away power, get input, you actually achieve more power than if you tried to do it yourself. Tell me a solution that one person has the answer all the way from the idea to operationalizing, and it worked out. Ain't gonna happen. So to me, it's just obvious. And listen, here's my theory on us versus them. If you're them, you're in deep doo-doo, right? So I think people use this us versus them and artificial separations to justify their biases. And I think I loved what you said about just having a voice and just understanding that we have a common interest, right? And I think it's more so the culture, and the culture allowing people to acknowledge their similarities, right? Let me say that again. I think it's the job of a leader in this environment is to create the environment where it's okay to acknowledge that you're both human. And you actually may both have a valid position on an issue, and yes, shockingly, you may each have a valid issue on a security issue that either side may be right on. So I think a lot of it is perspective, but that perspective is the real world of what we deal with inside our facilities day to day.
Holistic safety. Now, you've been a champion of holistic safety, a great supporter of holistic safety. I want to open this up to all three of you to talk a little bit about the work that you are doing that centers on holistic safety. And John, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best example for me of holistic safety, little self-promotion, is a housing unit in Pennsylvania called Little Scandinavia. And it's in SCI Chester, which is right outside of Philadelphia. But the coolest part about that program is the superintendent or warden who runs that program is a guy named Ken Eson. Let me tell you about Ken Eson. Ken grew up in North Philly. Ken's mom, single mom, sent him to Milton Hershey boarding school so he could be safe. He then went in the military and he came on board as a correctional officer. I was fortunate enough to meet Ken, I think when he was a lieutenant or a captain. Either way, I'll mention you Ken nationally. Get over it, right? But worked his way up. And Ken was one of the, I think 15 or 20 staff we were able to send to Scandinavia, to Norway and Sweden, where they were embedded, they functioned as their job in America in that system. And that was inspired by a trip I took, the first trip of American kind of corrections folks overseas. That was a vision of Don Spector, actually, from the prison law office. And he was so impacted by a tour of prisons in Georgia. He said, or not Georgia, sorry. Prisons in Georgia was one of the states that went with us on our first trip. The prisons in Germany, that he wanted to take us there, and he thought it would expand our vision. And boy, he was right. When I left there, I was so mad. I'm trying not to swear today, which is a struggle for me. But I was like, man, you got my head so screwed up, because I saw an environment. Forget the programs, forget all that stuff. Some of the stuff is apples and oranges, right? Culturally, we're more violent here. So just, we get it, right? But the environments they were able to create inside their facilities was unlike anything I had ever experienced. And we had to do it, right? But coming back, I remember, I was actually talking to Tom Clements, God rest his soul, who was on that trip with me, and shortly thereafter had it. I remember this last day, we were having this conversation, and we were so impressed, and we were both at the same time like, how do you bring this back? Like, I don't know what's gonna happen on that plane to be able to make any of this possible. And that was in 2013 or 2014. Little Scandinavia opened a month ago. Actually opened May 7th. But Little Scandinavia is run by somebody who a lot of people would have suggested would be in SCI Chester. And if you go into the housing unit, you would see exactly what I would expect to see at a place where people are respected. I gave them a housing unit. I said, suspend every rule. You create the own rules for the manual. We're going to randomly assign people to this, and we're going to measure outcomes. And it's funny, first of all, that we had to suspend rules about establishing a rapport with someone who's incarcerated. Like, actually knowing more about a person and understanding them is a threat to security. Like, come on, come on. But it was shocking to me when they brought these, how many of them were like, how much our systems frustrate things that in any other venue are stuff we use to be well, right? Tell me another circumstance where you can't interact in a human level with, like, your doctor. If your doctor didn't treat you like a human, you'd find a new doctor. I would suggest that if you can't just treat someone like a human, get a new job. That's not a high bar. That shouldn't be in your damn job description.
I heard a preach from the audience. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
But that's so true. And so looking at the very policies that stop human connection, that stop the ability for us to build trust with each other, that devalue people as people. Like, that's what I hear you saying, that you brought back from your trip and made sure was implemented in Pennsylvania.
In one place, in one housing unit. I mean, listen, this is not, it sounds simple, but it's complicated, right? And it's complicated because it's humans. I got a buddy, Dr. Conti, who does a lot of work with me in teaching people how to meet other people where they're at, right? So we kind of take the same approach, training staff and incarcerated people in how to communicate with each other, right? And what he says is that there's two kinds of people: people with issues and dead people. So we all got issues, right? And some of those issues sometimes come out with inappropriate and unhealthy relationships. If you have a healthy management structure, if you have oversight, if you have a real grievance system, and if you have the type of environment that people want to be at because it's a nice place to be, people will go out of their way to comply with rules. You can't name me a circumstance, an environment inside a corrections facility in America that is, as I described, that people feel meaningfully heard, that it's clean, that it's safe, that they have input, that there's chaos on. Those are not the units that guys like me lose sleep over.
Now, I want to open this up for Ronald and Andy for you to respond to anything that you just heard John say, but I also want to hear more about your work with your respective organizations that you're doing that really uplifts holistic safety.
At Just Leadership, we do a number of things. Our flagship program is a leadership development program we have for directly impacted people. One's called Leading with Conviction and Emerging Leaders. Since 2015, we've trained 1,300 leaders in 45 states plus Washington, D.C. to become advocates in this movement to reform the criminal justice system.
You can clap for that.
And we're very proud of that. I'm one of the graduates of the program myself. But I think one of the more things I'm more proud about today, we're doing a lot of policy work, and one of our policy platforms that we're working on is called Just Us. And it was around in response to the COVID-19 situation in jails and prisons when COVID hit in 2019. Everybody was running around trying to figure out what to do, filing motions, trying to get people out of jails and prisons to reduce the population. And there just was not a mechanism in place for that to happen. And we recognized that. So we looked at history, and just going back to Hurricane Katrina, we discovered that they had emergency management programs, release programs for dogs and cats in the Humane Society for Katrina, but nothing for the people that were in the jails and prisons down there. So we took that knowledge and we helped develop a program, a policy around emergency management in correctional facilities, and it's currently a bill that's pending in the federal legislature. And what we saw and what we thought about, it wasn't just a benefit for the incarcerated people, which people think, well, just because we fight for incarcerated people, it was a boon for the officers as well. We saw an opportunity to be holistic and humanely toward officers as well, because they have to come in and out of there. So their safety was just as much a concern to us as the safety of those incarcerated. So we developed this policy around trying to implement an emergency management plan to deal with situations such as COVID, hurricanes, fires, and the ice storm in Texas a year or so ago, to deal with these situations, to relieve the overcrowding of these congregate living situations. And so that's one of the things that I'm most proud about with Just Leadership and the work that we're doing.
Thank you for that, Ronald. I want you to repeat that number of people who have graduated from emerging leaders.
Leading with conviction and emerging leaders. 1,300 leaders in 45 states plus Washington, D.C. since 2015.
Nice job. Yeah.
I wanted you to repeat that number because one thing that I hear time and time again, particularly from correctional administrators, is that, when they work with someone who has been incarcerated, they view that person as the exception. And I want people to understand that you are the rule. There are so many people who have expertise in these systems and have left these systems. And as John said, if we as correctional administrators and people in positions of authority think that we have all the answers, then we're sadly mistaken. The answers really rest with these two stakeholder groups, people who have been incarcerated and staff.
Can I just respond real quick? That's a ridiculous statement. That someone who is incarcerated and because they're smart, they're exceptional. Like, there's only 50 corrections, right? I'm exceptional. Listen, the surprise person up here on this panel is me. I grew up in poverty, abandoned foster care. Like, I'm the exception. That's the kind of framing that just allows us to exclude people to not be at the table. That's an insecure human being.
But John,
that's a crazy statement.
And we hear it all the time. Don't you hear it? I mean, when we talk with our colleagues, correctional administrators, that's what I hear time and time again. Oh, so-and-so is the exception. Oh, well, I'll work with someone who's been incarcerated, but it has to be the right person.
Listen, I think Andy framed this from the beginning. You got to understand about correctional culture, right? We don't trust anybody, right? And we don't believe anything. And so it's difficult to break down these walls. And that's why everything goes back to the environment you create where it's safe or okay to do that, right? So listen, we've all made statements if we're gonna say sides or us versus them, I would say it like this: no matter what uniform you're wearing inside one of these facilities, the culture dictates your behavior. And if the culture is you can't interact with somebody, and Andy will tell you this, he worked the blocks just a lot. If you grew up with somebody and the culture says at that place you don't shake hands, you could know that person for 20 years and you would not shake hands. You would look at each other like this. And I've done it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Conversely, if it's a culture where it's okay to interact like human beings, you interact like human beings. And that's a leadership in one case, and both my prisons, so I'm talking about myself, right? In one case, that's a leadership failure. In the other case, the leadership was able to make folks safe. And one more thing, and Andy, I'd love for you to jump in here with me on this. But they are, listen, sitting in these jobs, these are exceptional. There's 50 of us. They're political appointments. You get fired any minute. But part of the us versus them that I think is a limiting factor is this union versus administration, right? Incarcerated people versus officers versus administrators versus advocates. Like, what we need to do and what this holistic safety platform, why I'm so excited about this, is let's just kick out all the BS and let's just identify the commonalities and start with that. And you know, Rob Jeffries right here in Illinois, right? Courageous, young, new, trying to change a difficult culture. You think anybody can do that by themselves? No. And so it takes allies, not just, Ron's not the only person up here who needs an ally, right? Andy needs an ally. Like the three of us, the four of us, we have commonalities. If Kevin Kemp was here, you're witnessing people who came up in a bunch of different directions, right? Bunch of different experiences who have a common understanding. So it is possible when that's the goal. The question is, in places that it's not happening, what's the goal?
Yes. We are the rule. Andy?
Yeah, I would say that's exactly right. And it's always hard after going after you, John. So can we break this order up a little bit? And let me comment first, then you can. No, you spoke a lot of truth, without any doubt about it. I think in some ways, holistic safety is the foundation for some change. And I know that going to Scandinavian countries allows us a place to reimagine. Just when I went to some different countries, Scandinavian systems work better, they seem safer, but the society is different as well, and we have to bring that into the conversation because the origins of prisons in this country play a big role in what takes place today. It's a system that was born, founded on, and still built upon racism. We have to say that, we have to understand it in order to dismantle the things that are killing everybody on both sides of this. And then we have to understand what we have to do as a country. Our country is fascinated with law enforcement and corrections for the wrong reasons. They want to see somebody with a shield. They want to see the thug dragging somebody. They want to see somebody getting maced, tased, whatever. It's for the wrong reasons. And we incarcerate way too many people for the wrong reasons, right? So at some point, I think we got to bring that into the conversation. But the systems in Scandinavian countries, there's a lot to bring back. As you said, John, you went over there, you saw, you could reimagine. And as a good leader, you brought that back. And holistic safety, for me, is probably some of the best refined that we can bring into our system that will work. And that has to do with the work that we all are doing. One Voice United is really starting a little bit late into the reform movement, but I felt like there was a blind spot in the reform movement. I felt like you're reforming and you're trying to change a system that all of the folks that I worked with and grew up with in the system do not see themselves in this change. They don't hear that this system is being changed for them too. And I'm going to just share this with you. I've lost a lot of people that I grew up with in this system that were good people that would have loved to have seen change and went home to their family at night and said, I'm a part of something bigger and something better. And they never were able to do that. So we're not an anomaly, right? There is a lot of folks I know that work there that want something better. And it is risky. There is that risk because Ronald and I can share with you, working in there and living in there, You are not allowed to cross those lines for many reasons, not just because of the way the system is designed and ran at the top. Because there's a lot of good people at the top that want to empower their staff. They want to bring those voices all together. One Voice United is really trying to bring those frontline staff to a place where they can start to reimagine something different, and they can play a role in shaping that instead of resisting it. They can be a resource to that. It's a lot of work. It's hard. It's tough. We don't have a big bench, as you're saying. That's a part of what this is supposed to be about, is getting that out there and provoking people to try to get involved. So I agree with almost everything you said, John.
Listen,
There is an us versus them.
yeah,
I want to have more conversation about it because that's there.
yeah.
But we can talk later.
Well, it's interesting to me. I'm sorry. Here I go. The emotion, to understand that as a correctional officer coming off a shift, right? What happened inside that facility impacts your children directly after your drive home. Period. And I would tell anybody working in corrections, every one of those days you were the best dad you could be. It's terrible. So don't, I mean, I hear you. Look, I spent 9 years as an officer, came up, we speak the same language. But it's just going on for too long. And we as a field, I mean, criminal justice policy needs an intellectual evolution. Like, we got to start thinking differently about these things, right? And we have terrible data, and we have all these things that stand in the way of us really measuring progress. But we talk about commonalities, we all agree we got to do better, right? We can start with that at least.
And we're starting there, right? I mean, we talk about the tenets of holistic safety, but I wanted to just bring in a reality, just having people who have worked in this system, sitting with people who have led this system, sitting with people who have been incarcerated in this system. Like, we are exemplifying connectedness and trust. There is risk in us sitting here together and saying that there is some horrible things happening in jails and prisons that need to change. But there is also power in us coming together and saying that we want to be a part of that change, and holistic safety is a pathway toward that. And so I just wanted to bring that into this moment, because we are all connected with each other.
Don't forget that there's tables that have this same makeup inside the household at Thanksgiving.
Yes.
A lot of them. There are a lot of people who work in corrections who have family members incarcerated. A lot.
Can I, John, back to your previous point. I grew up in a pretty rough neighborhood as well. Didn't have a lot of options. It was a way for me to get into the middle class. I didn't grow up saying I want to be a corrections officer. Many of my friends went to prison. And when I'm working in there, and one of them comes up and says, "Andy, how are you doing?" and wants to shake my hand. And I got to say, we cannot do that. Number one, your life might be threatened. And number two, my job could be threatened, and or both of us could be threatened in some way. Right?
That's real.
That steals stuff from them.
That's real.
And it steals stuff from me. Some of these people I looked up to my whole life growing up. And to see them in there and not be able to help. And I came into this profession, and I'll stop here. I came into this profession like a lot of others, thinking somehow I'm going to make a difference with my life experience. I'm going to come into this, it's decent money, and I'm going to be able to help. If I can help one person, right? And the light in your eyes go out from the time you finish getting trained and you walk through those front gates to do the work, because you realize very quickly that's not why you're there. And I'll stop there.
Let me just interject real briefly here. I was thinking as hearing both of them talk, the solutions to these things that we're talking about are simple. What makes them hard is people lack courage.
Yes.
They lack courage to implement. They lack courage to speak out against injustices. As long as it's not affecting them, I don't care. Even the people that's involved, and not everybody want to stand up and take the heat that comes from interacting with, crossing these cultural divides that we face, not just in incarceration, but in our communities as well. It takes courage. And we have a lot of spineless people in government, in the community. People will see wrong and will not say nothing. I don't get that. So if we grow a backbone, grow a spine, you see a lot of change in this country.
Go see the wizard.
Yeah.
And recognize that, again, we're all impacted. There's no, this is not impacting me. We're all impacted by what happens in these systems. I want to we have just a few minutes left. My time goes by so quickly. I want to address some of the questions that we've received from the audience. One of them raises the point, Andy, that you raised about sorry, I don't do well with electronics. But one of them raises the point that you made, Andy, about racism and oppression. And the question is, how do we address the systemic and structural barriers like racism and oppression that are catalysts of mass incarceration? How do we address these things? Anyone want to start us off? I know, Andy, you don't want to go behind John, so you want to kick us off?
I don't like to go after Ronald either because they're both much more polished speakers than I am. Number one, first and foremost, I'll be the first to admit my ignorance to a lot of it. So it's a hard conversation for me to have because there's a lot about racism that I'm ignorant to. But I am willing to lean in on that. I am willing to step in and have that conversation. I know a lot of corrections officers, when I bring up structural racism, will say, so I'm a racist because I work inside of a prison, because I'm trying to make a living, because I try to do the right thing? No, I think the start of this has to be the conversation about the system. Let's not get so caught up into saying that because you're in there, because you're working in there, because you don't understand the perpetuation to this. I'm still learning it myself. But to have that conversation is not an easy one. But folks will have it if they understand and we put in perspective that it's the system that we first need to break down, the layers of it, and what it's there for, and what it was built to do. Isn't that? Then we can start to examine ourselves and say, look, am I perpetuating something inside of this that needs to change? But to have the conversation, I think, is the very first step.
Well, how about we stop promulgating it by using this extreme language when we talk about other people? Hey, put R or D behind it, and then it got real problems, right? We got to stop using such divisive language. It really starts with that. And then we have to have the courage to quantify it. And not just quantify it, this is the impact. And then reverse engineer it. Let's look at policies. If it had a disparate impact, if I'm walking down the street and Andy's walking down the street and we perform the same act and I'm more likely to be incarcerated, I'm more likely to spend more time, that's not okay, right? But we have to start with the conversation to acknowledge that, listen, it's there, this is where it came from. But every time, like there's one or two states in the country that have a bill that measures potential racial disparity before a criminal justice bill is passed. And when I talked to the two states, I was trying to get this done in Pennsylvania, which I clearly didn't over the last decade. In neither place has it been impactful, interestingly. Now, I will tell you, every bill in Pennsylvania requires a fiscal note, right? And so you have to quantify what the impact is going to be to the taxpayers. So let's figure out some policy stopgaps we can put in place to not expand the racism, right? And let's really start undoing it. But it really, again, it's let's create the environment and have the right people in the room with the right data. I mean, it doesn't sound like that's not something you'd be rallying, right? It'd be hard to chant that out front, right? But that's really how system change. It's the right people in the room with a broad enough perspective, with real data, so we can figure out a common ground to start moving forward. But in the meantime, let's just relax a little bit about the language we use and the divisiveness. Let's just start using language of unity, because that's really the answer. Like, again, anybody who thinks that the fate of everybody involved in the system, working, living, loving either of those groups, is not inextricably linked, it's linked. That's right.
And give each other a little grace,
Please.
right? To have space to have that conversation.
Ronald, did you want to add anything?
No, the next question.
Okay. I do think it's also important for us to talk about, when we talk about these barriers and racism and the system that mass incarceration has been built upon. I think it's important for us to talk about the significance of investing in Black and Brown communities and making sure that Black and Brown communities have the resources and supports that they need on the front end, so we don't continue to punish people on the back end. I do believe that we need to really look at, and I know this is not going to be a popular statement in the room amongst people who work in corrections, but we really need to think about the money that is spent in corrections, the $81 billion a year, and how we can revamp some of that money from corrections and put it back in community. That, to me, is how we begin to tackle this system of racism.
I want to just say one thing to this. I think you're absolutely right about the investment up front. It has to be there before there's even an interaction on the streets, right? That goes the wrong way. But I would say this, the us versus them is in that. Reforming this system is expensive. To do it the right way is going to cost money. We should not shy away from that, because it's an investment in human beings. And the return is on the front end and the back end. But to divert, I've seen 30 years of this pendulum swing. And I'm scared to death that it's going to swing back, and it's because of money. This is America. And if everybody understands and believes it's as powerful as we say it is, we should be able to do both. It should not be this or that. It shouldn't be that, because that's how we got here to begin with, is to say, let's put money into this, but not that. The system's there. It's a big system. You said we incarcerate too much. We do. They're there. We have to invest in this system to get it right. It's expensive, but we also have to put...
I'm going to push. We have just under a minute left, but I want to say this. Now, I do believe that we have to ensure resources and supports are on hand for people incarcerated as well as staff. But I believe that we can be responsible enough to resource community organizations to fund the needs and supports that exist within community, and also to provide the services within facilities. To me, that is real investment in people, and that will also help us to eliminate some of these structural barriers. Before we end, I would love for each of us, just a lightning round, to tell our audience, virtual and in person, how they can engage in this work. Someone out there thinking about how they can begin to uplift holistic safety. What advice would you give them? 10 seconds, each of us.
You want to go first?
I'm going first. A couple of things. At Just Leadership, we have a sign-on letter on our website for the Just Us program that I mentioned earlier, and to get your local representative, state representative to support it. Go to jlusa.org, click on there, go to Just Us, and you'll see the sign-on letter. Click on the boxes, it automatically identifies your state rep for you, and it'll submit the letter for you as well. You just click, click, click. And the other thing, put the humanity back in being human. We have to do that. It's only one race, the human race. Let's put the humanity back into being human, and all will be well.
So I think, first of all, just get involved. Like the only thing that moves legislation policy is if enough of you care to that it gets to a majority, right? That's how this works. It's not magical. It's not science. So number one, care. Number two, I think it's important that we start talking about the conditions of confinement. I think it's important to demand our corrections officials to not be so opaque, which has really undersold our potential as a field. Open up the doors, but get involved and let policymakers know that you care, right? Because funding goes with what cares. And I will tell you that if a majority of politicians care about something, they don't look for financial offsets, right? Like we talk about, oh, let's take money from prison and put it in the community. So let's take money from this black and brown community and put it to this black and brown community, and it's not gonna be enough for either of them. We've had that already, right? Let's fund these systems to do what we ask them to do. Let's fund prisons to help people get healthy. Let's fund communities so they don't need damn prisons to get healthy.
That's right. I would say two things to that. Get involved, like you're saying, John. If you're a person of position, if you're a person of power, if you're just a citizen that cares about our society and cares about correcting a system that's absolutely was never built for success, then get involved and use that position, use yourself, use your voice to make a change. And the other part of this is we talked about risk. If we're all not willing to take those risks, like we can preach to the choir all day, but if the public and those who are being affected are not willing to take a risk, right, then this will never change. We all have to step into this together and take a risk and recognize that there's a lot of impact all the way around when it comes to this system. And I really appreciate being here.
Well, we appreciate having all of you, and that is our time for today. With that, I just want to thank our panelists for being willing to stand with us. I think what you have heard today is that we don't agree on everything, nor should we, but because we come from divergent pathways. But as John said earlier, one thing that we do agree on is that we all deserve to be safe. And it's up to us to be willing to lean into our disagreements and to find that common ground for how we can all be safe. I want to thank our audience in person and virtual for joining us today. And if you will visit us on our website, chicagobeyond.org, for more information on our vision for holistic safety. And if you have questions or comments that's either sparked by the vision or by today's conversation, feel free to visit us at chicagobeyond.org/do I have the right to feel safe/. We thank you, and we hope that this is just the start of the conversation, but most importantly, the start to action.